the girl begged. "Don't lock us in here." But all she received was silence and closed doors. The cruel stepmother locked her and her baby brother in the doghouse whenever she wanted to punish them. One night, the millionaire father arrived unexpectedly, heard the children crying and stormed into the yard shouting. What he found there made him act immediately, and what happened next shocked everyone around him. 8-year-old Emma Richardson pressed her small face against the nursery window, watching the rain streak down the glass like tears. In her arms, baby Michael squirmed and whimpered, his tiny fists clutching at her worn cotton nightgown. She bounced him gently, the way she had learned to do over these past terrible months, humming a lullaby she could barely remember her mother singing. The melody came in fragments now, like broken pieces of a mirror that would never fit back together properly. Everything had changed the day her mother left them. One moment, Emma had been the cherished, daughter of Elizabeth and Richard Richardson, living in a world filled with bedtime stories, warm hugs and laughter that echoed through the marble halls of their Greenwich mansion. The next, her mother was gone forever, and baby Michael had arrived, a tiny creature who needed constant care, who cried through the night, who represented both the last precious connection to the woman they had lost and the reason she was no longer with them. Emma's father had retreated into his work almost immediately. Richard Richardson, once present for every school play and ballet recital, now spent his days and nights at his investment firm's Manhattan office, returning home only to sleep and change clothes. When he looked at Emma now, something flickered in his eyes before he quickly looked away. Pain, perhaps, or guilt. She was never quite sure, and she was too young to understand that sometimes adults run from their grief instead of facing it. Within 3 months, Victoria Ashford had entered their lives. Emma still remembered that first meeting in the grand foyer, how her father had nervously introduced this elegant woman with ice-blue eyes and perfectly coiffed blonde hair. Victoria had smiled then, a calculated expression that never quite reached her eyes, and said all the right things about helping the family heal, about understanding Richard's pain, about wanting to provide the children with stability. Emma's father, drowning in his own sorrow and overwhelmed by the demands of single parenthood, had seen a lifeline. Emma had seen something else entirely, something she couldn't name, but felt deep in her bones, like a coming storm. The wedding had been quiet, almost secretive, held in the study rather than the garden where her parents had exchanged vows 7 years earlier. Emma had stood there in her best dress, holding Michael on her hip because he cried whenever she put him down, and watched her father promise to love and cherish this stranger. Victoria had worn white, which even at 8 years old had seemed wrong somehow, disrespectful to the woman whose place she was taking. The changes started small, so small that Emma's father didn't notice them at all. Victoria began removing Elizabeth's belongings from sight, claiming they made the atmosphere too melancholy. The family photographs disappeared from the mantel, replaced by stark modern art. Elizabeth's favorite lavender sachets vanished from the closets. The music box that had played Claire de Lune, a gift from Emma's grandmother, mysteriously broke and was thrown away before it could be repaired. Each erasure was accomplished with clinical efficiency, and when Emma asked about her mother's things, Victoria would smile that cold smile and say something about moving forward, about not dwelling in the past, about what was best for everyone's mental health. But it was the small cruelties that truly revealed Victoria's nature. Emma would call for help with her homework, and Victoria would walk right past her door without acknowledging her voice. Emma would come downstairs for breakfast to find Victoria feeding Michael, but no place set for her. When Emma set her own place, Victoria would comment on her clumsiness, her awkward movements, her inability to do even simple tasks correctly. The criticisms were delivered in a soft, almost concerned tone, with her father never quite present to witness them. The household staff noticed. Mrs. Chen, the elderly housekeeper who had worked for the family since before Emma was born, began leaving little notes hidden in Emma's schoolbooks. They said things like, "Be strong, sweetheart," or "You are braver than you know," or "Remember your mother's love." Emma would find these messages and clutch them like lifelines, these small acknowledgements that she wasn't imagining the coldness that now permeated her home. Carlos, the young gardener, would wink at her when their paths crossed, a tiny gesture of solidarity. And Maria, one of the cooks, once slipped cookies into Emma's jacket pocket when Victoria wasn't looking. These small acts of kindness were all they dared, because Victoria ruled the house with an iron fist, and anyone who crossed her found themselves without employment by the end of the week. The staff had families to feed, bills to pay, and so they helped where they could while trying to keep their positions. The verbal abuse escalated as the months passed. Victoria's indifference hardened into active hostility. She would mock Emma's appearance, calling her scrawny and plain. She would criticize her intelligence, suggesting she must have inherited her father's business sense because she clearly hadn't gotten her mother's grace. She would compare her unfavorably to other children, to imaginary perfect daughters who never made mistakes or caused trouble. Emma absorbed it all in silence, her small shoulders carrying burdens no child should bear. She couldn't complain to her father, who was either at work or too exhausted to engage when he was home. Besides, Victoria was careful. She saved her cruelest moments for when Richard was absent, and she had a talent for looking innocent and concerned whenever he appeared. In his presence, she was the devoted stepmother, overwhelmed by the demands of caring for 2 children, one of them an infant, while trying to be supportive of her grieving husband. The first physical punishment came on a Tuesday evening in October. Emma had been carrying a glass of water upstairs to the nursery, where Michael was crying for his bottle. Her hands were small, the glass slippery with condensation, and it had slipped from her grasp halfway up the grand staircase. The crash of breaking glass had brought Victoria running, and her face had transformed into something terrible. What followed was a tirade that left Emma shaking. Victoria screamed about carelessness, about ingratitude, about the expense of replacing crystal that had been in the family for generations. She grabbed Emma's arm with fingers that dug in like claws, dragging her through the kitchen, past the shocked faces of the staff and out into the backyard. There, next to the garden shed, stood an old doghouse that had belonged to the family's golden retriever before the dog had passed away years earlier. Victoria shoved Emma inside the cramped space, then went back for Michael, who had been left screaming in his crib. She placed the baby in Emma's arms and locked the small door with a padlock. They spent 4 hours in that dark, cold space, Emma holding her baby brother and trying to keep him warm, trying to quiet his cries, trying to understand how her life had become this nightmare. When Victoria finally released them, it was with a warning that any mention of this to her father would result in much worse. And so began a pattern. Any small mistake, any perceived slight, any moment when Victoria's mood turned dark would result in punishment. Sometimes it was confinement in the doghouse. Other times Emma would be denied meals or forced to complete impossible tasks like scrubbing the entire first floor with a toothbrush. Victoria seemed to take pleasure in Emma's suffering, in breaking down this small girl who represented everything she resented about her new husband's past. Emma endured. She had no choice. But more than that, she endured because of Michael. Her baby brother needed her. He was the only family she had left, the only connection to her mother, and she would protect him with everything she had. She learned to anticipate Victoria's moods, to deflect her anger, to take punishments meant for both of them onto herself alone. At 8 years old, Emma Richardson became both mother and shield to her infant brother. Father Murphy, the priest from St. Mary's, where the Richardson family had attended Mass for generations, began to notice changes in Emma during Sunday services. The bright, chatty little girl, who used to volunteer answers during children's liturgy, had become withdrawn and silent. She flinched when adults moved too quickly near her. She had dark circles under her eyes and had lost weight. Her clothes, while expensive, often seemed hastily put on, and there were bruises on her arms that she tried to hide. After Mass one Sunday, Father Murphy approached Richard Richardson with careful words about perhaps spending more time with his daughter, about the importance of presence during grief, about how children sometimes struggle to express their pain. Richard had nodded, promised to do better, but the next week, nothing had changed. Father Murphy, sensing something deeper but without proof, began making quiet visits to the Richardson estate, ostensibly to check on the family's spiritual well-being. Victoria always met him at the door, with perfect hostility masked as hospitality, and the children were conveniently napping or studying during these visits. One afternoon, while Victoria was out meeting with her personal trainer, Emma was exploring the mansion's many rooms, something she did when she needed to feel close to her mother's memory. In what had once been her parents' bedroom, now redecorated in Victoria's cold minimalist style, Emma opened an antique armoire that had belonged to her grandmother. Behind the hanging clothes pushed far back against the wall, she found a large framed photograph. It was her parents' wedding portrait, the one that used to hang above the fireplace in the living room. Emma pulled it out carefully, her small hands trembling. Her mother looked so beautiful in the photograph, radiant with joy as she gazed at Emma's father. But something was wrong. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she saw what had been done. Someone had taken a black permanent marker and scribbled violently across her mother's face, defacing the image with harsh, angry strokes. The vandalism was personal, hateful, and unmistakably deliberate. Emma understood in that moment the depth of Victoria's resentment. This wasn't just about control or cruelty. Victoria hated Elizabeth Richardson, hated her memory, hated that Richard had loved someone else first and better. Emma was living proof of that previous love, and so she had become the target of Victoria's rage. The realization terrified her because it meant there might be no limit to what Victoria would do. That night, Emma overheard something that made her blood run cold. She had gotten up to check on Michael and heard voices coming from her father's study. Victoria was on the phone, her voice low but audible through the partially open door. Emma crept closer, her heart pounding. "I really think we need to consider residential treatment," Victoria was saying. "She's been increasingly unstable, Richard. The trauma of losing her mother has clearly affected her mental health. She has outbursts, she imagines things, and honestly, I'm worried about her influence on Michael. There's a facility in upstate New York that specializes in childhood grief and behavioral issues, just for a few months until she stabilizes." Emma pressed, her hand over her mouth to keep from crying out. Victoria was trying to have her sent away. She would be separated from Michael, locked up somewhere far from home, while Victoria had free rein over her baby brother and her father's fortune. The manipulation was brilliant and terrifying, reframing Emma's suffering as mental illness rather than abuse. Emma fled back to her room, her mind racing. She needed proof. She needed something concrete that would make her father see the truth. But what could an 8-year-old girl possibly do against an adult who had thought of everything? The answer came 2 days later, during another of her explorations through the mansion. In Victoria's private office, a room Emma had been explicitly forbidden from entering, she found a leather-bound journal pushed to the back of a desk drawer. Emma knew she shouldn't look, knew the punishment if she was caught would be severe, but desperation made her brave. She opened the book and began to read. What she found was worse than she could have imagined. Page after page of Victoria's neat handwriting detailed her contempt for Emma and Michael, referring to them as burdens and obstacles. There were calculations of Richard's net worth, notes about transferring assets, and disturbingly clinical observations about the household staff and their weaknesses. Most chilling were the entries about Emma's punishments, described with cold precision as behavior modification techniques, complete with notes about which approaches were most effective at breaking the child's spirit. Emma's hands shook as she read. This journal was evidence, proof of Victoria's true nature, but she was 8 years old. Who would believe her if she tried to show anyone? Victoria would simply claim Emma had fabricated it, or worse, use it as further proof of Emma's supposed mental instability. Still, Emma carefully noted where the journal was kept, memorizing every detail. Someday, somehow, this evidence might save them. As autumn deepened into winter, Victoria's behavior grew bolder. She no longer bothered to hide her cruelty from the staff, confident in her control over them. Emma spent more nights in the doghouse than in her own bed. She was forced to carry Michael everywhere, even when her small arms ached from his weight. She was denied proper meals, given only enough to keep her functional. The mansion that had once been her beloved home became a prison, and Victoria its warden. But Emma refused to break. Every time Victoria pushed her down, she got back up. Every time she was locked away, she used the time to comfort Michael, to whisper stories about the mother he would never remember, to promise him that someday things would be better. She didn't know how she would keep that promise, but she made it anyway, because hope was all they had left. Richard Richardson returned from his business trip to Tokyo on a cold December morning, exhausted from 18 hours of travel and ready for the comfort of home. But, as his car pulled up the circular driveway of the Greenwich mansion, something felt wrong. The house looked the same as always, grand and imposing against the winter sky, but there was a quality to the silence that unsettled him. No children's voices, no sounds of life, just an oppressive quiet that seemed to seep from the very walls. He entered through the front door to find Victoria in the foyer, perfectly composed in a cream-colored cashmere sweater and tailored slacks. She kissed his cheek with cool lips and took his coat, asking about his flight with the kind of perfunctory interest one might show a casual acquaintance. When Richard asked about Emma and Michael, Victoria waved her hand dismissively and said they were resting, that Emma had been having one of her difficult days, and it was better not to disturb them. Something in her tone triggered an alarm in Richard's mind. He had been absent, he knew that, drowning himself in work to avoid the pain of his loss and the guilt of how quickly he had tried to replace Elizabeth. But hearing his daughter described as difficult by this woman who was supposed to be caring, for her sparked something he had buried deep. He climbed the stairs to the nursery, ignoring Victoria's protests about letting the children sleep. What he found there broke something inside him. Emma sat in the rocking chair, her small body curved protectively around Michael. Both children were thin, too thin, and Emma had bruises on her arms in various stages of healing. The nursery itself was cold, the radiator clearly turned off despite the winter chill. Emma's eyes widened when she saw him, and the look on her face, that mixture of desperate hope and learned wariness, made his heart clench with recognition. This was fear. His daughter was afraid, and not just in this moment, but in a deep, habitual way that spoke of months of suffering. Richard knelt beside the chair, keeping his movements slow and gentle. "Emma, sweetheart," he said quietly, his voice cracking, "I need you to tell me the truth. Are you okay? Are you being treated well?" Emma's eyes filled with tears, but she said nothing. Her silence was more damning than any accusation could have been. Richard noticed how she tightened her grip on Michael, how she positioned herself between the baby and the door, ready to protect him. She had learned not to trust adults, maybe even learned not to trust him, and that realization cut him deeper than anything else could have. Over the next few days, Richard began to truly observe his household for the first time in months. He noticed how the staff avoided Victoria's gaze, how they tensed when she entered a room. He saw how Emma flinched when Victoria's voice grew sharp, how the little girl had developed the habit of making herself small and invisible. He heard Victoria snap at his daughter over trivial matters, using words designed to diminish and hurt. And he watched as his wife of barely 7 months revealed herself to be someone entirely different from the woman he thought he had married. Father Murphy's unexpected visit on Thursday afternoon provided another piece of the puzzle. The priest, with careful diplomacy, shared his concerns about Emma's well-being, about changes in her behavior and appearance. He mentioned bruises, weight loss, and a fear that seemed inappropriate for a child in a loving home. Richard felt shame wash over him as he realized that an outsider had noticed what he, Emma's own father, had been too absent and self-absorbed to see. That evening, while Victoria was out having dinner with friends, Richard did something he would later recognize as the first step toward redemption. He asked Mrs. Chen to join him in his study and promised her that whatever she told him would result in no retaliation. The elderly housekeeper, who had served his family with loyalty for 3 decades, broke down in tears and told him everything. The punishments, the confinement in the doghouse, the verbal abuse, the systematic destruction of Elizabeth's memory, the staff's helplessness in the face of Victoria's threats. She showed him the note she had been leaving for Emma, those small gestures of comfort that were all she dared to give. Richard listened with growing horror and rage. He had failed his daughter in the worst possible way. Consumed by his own grief and guilt over Elizabeth's passing during childbirth, he had abandoned Emma and Michael to a woman who saw them as obstacles rather than children. He had been so eager to reconstruct some semblance of a normal family that he had married a stranger without truly knowing her character. And in doing so, he had brought a monster into his home, But horror and rage alone would not be enough. Victoria was clever and manipulative, skilled at presenting one face to the world while wearing another in private. If Richard confronted her without proof, she would deny everything, twist the narrative, perhaps even make good on her threat to have Emma institutionalized for imagined mental health issues. He needed evidence, something irrefutable. That night, Richard made phone calls to his head of security and explained what he needed. Within 24 hours, tiny cameras were discreetly installed throughout the house, hidden in smoke detectors, picture frames and decorative objects. The system recorded continuously, capturing every moment of life in the Richardson mansion. Richard felt guilty for the surveillance, for the invasion of privacy, but his children's safety mattered more than his discomfort with the methods. What the cameras revealed over the next week was systematic abuse captured in horrifying detail. Victoria's cruelty was documented in full color and sound. Emma being dragged down the hall by her arm, her small feet barely touching the ground. Victoria screaming in the little girl's face, calling her worthless and stupid and a burden. The confinement in the doghouse, with both children huddled together in the darkness while Victoria locked them in. Emma being forced to carry Michael until she collapsed from exhaustion, then being berated for her weakness. The denial of meals, the mockery, the constant degradation designed to break a child's spirit. Richard watched the footage in his office, his hands clenched into fists, tears streaming down his face. This was his fault. Every moment of Emma's suffering, every tear, every instance of terror, all of it had happened because he had failed to protect his children. He had been so lost in his own pain that he had delivered his daughter into the hands of someone who took pleasure in hurting her. The guilt was overwhelming, but he channeled it into determination. Victoria would pay for what she had done, and Richard would spend the rest of his life making amends to his children. He contacted his attorney, a sharp woman named Rebecca Foster, who had handled his business dealings for years. When he showed her the footage, Rebecca's face hardened with professional outrage. They had more than enough evidence for criminal charges, she assured him. Child abuse, child endangerment, possibly more once they investigated Victoria's background more thoroughly. Rebecca also found something interesting in her preliminary research. Victoria's financial record showed suspicious patterns, large transfers that didn't align with her claimed income or legitimate expenses. With Emma's reluctant permission, Richard retrieved Victoria's journal from her office. Reading his wife's cold assessment of his children as obstacles to be removed, seeing her calculated plans to isolate Emma and control his wealth, feeling the contempt she held for him written in her own hand, Richard understood that he had been deceived from the very beginning. Victoria had never loved him. She had seen a wealthy widower drowning, in grief, and seized an opportunity. The revelation came at a dinner party Richard hosted for business associates and friends, an event Victoria had been planning for weeks as a showcase of her role as the perfect society wife. The dining room glittered with crystal and candlelight, the table laden with expensive catering, and Victoria presided over it all with practiced grace. She had no idea that every one of the guests had been briefed beforehand about what they were about to witness. After the main course, Richard stood and called for everyone's attention. What followed was a methodical dismantling of Victoria's carefully constructed facade. He played selected footage on the large screen he had set up, showing Victoria's abuse of Emma with clinical precision. He shared excerpts from her journal, revealing her contempt and manipulation. He presented financial records prepared by Rebecca, showing embezzlement and fraud. And through it all, he watched his wife's face transform from confident to panicked to desperate. Victoria tried to defend herself, her voice rising in pitch as she grasped for explanations. She claimed the footage was doctored, that Emma was a disturbed child who required firm discipline, that Richard had misunderstood her private writings. She threatened and pleaded in equal measure, her mask completely shattered, but the evidence was overwhelming, and the witnesses had seen more than enough. Richard had contacted the police before the dinner began. Officers arrived just as Victoria's denials descended into threats about destroying his reputation and taking everything he had. They arrested her in front of everyone, reading her rights as she screamed about lawyers and lawsuits. The handcuffs clicking shut around her wrists marked the end of her reign of terror over the Richardson household. The aftermath was complicated and painful. Victoria faced multiple charges, and her trial would eventually result in a significant prison sentence. More digging revealed that she had done this before, marrying wealthy men and systematically abusing their children while manipulating assets. Richard's case would help put an end to her pattern of predation. But the legal consequences for Victoria were only the beginning. The real work lay in healing his family, and Richard quickly learned that redemption would not come through grand gestures or promises. It would come through daily presence, through patience, through earning back trust that had been shattered. Those first weeks after Victoria's arrest were the hardest of Richard's life. He reduced his work hours drastically, delegating responsibilities so he could be home every morning and evening. He learned to make breakfast, though his first attempts at pancakes were disasters that made even Emma smile slightly. He sat with Michael for hours, letting the baby grow accustomed to his presence, learning the routines of feeding and changing and comforting that he had neglected for too long. With Emma, progress was slower and more painful. She was deeply traumatized, her trust in adults severely damaged. She barely spoke to him at first, responding to his questions with single words or silence. She still moved through the house like she expected punishment at any moment, still positioned herself as a shield for Michael. Mrs. Chen and Father Murphy helped, their familiar presence providing continuity and support. Richard learned that healing required consistency more than drama. He showed up every single day. He attended Emma's parent-teacher conferences, which revealed that his daughter, despite everything she had endured, had maintained good grades through sheer determination. He took both children to therapy, individual and family sessions, where they began to process their trauma with professional help. He read to them every night, starting with simple picture books and gradually moving to longer stories as Emma began to trust his presence. Small victories became major milestones. The first time Michael reached for Richard instead of Emma, the baby's trust slowly rebuilding. The day Emma accepted a hug without flinching. The afternoon when Richard found his daughter crying and she let him hold her instead of hiding her tears. The evening when Emma finally told him in halting words about the worst of what Victoria had done. Each moment of connection was precious, hard-won, and Richard treasured them all. He had the doghouse demolished and replaced with a garden that Emma helped design. They planted flowers together, Emma carefully choosing varieties that her mother had loved. The garden became a memorial and a symbol, transforming a place of suffering into something beautiful. Father Murphy blessed it in a small ceremony, and for the first time since Elizabeth's passing, Emma spoke about her mother without crying. The mansion itself changed as the Richardson family healed. Photographs of Elizabeth returned to their rightful places, her memory honored rather than erased. The cold minimalism Victoria had imposed gave way to warmer touches, comfortable furniture that invited lounging, rather than intimidated guests. Children's artwork appeared on the refrigerator, toys scattered across living room floors. The house became a home again, filled with the messy, chaotic, beautiful reality of family life. Richard learned to be present not just physically but emotionally. He listened when Emma needed to talk. He played when Michael wanted attention. He attended every school event, every doctor's appointment, every moment that mattered. He said no to business trips that would take him away for more than a night. He chose his children over his career, over his social obligations, over everything else, because he had learned the hard way what happened when he failed to prioritize them. A year after Victoria's arrest, on a quiet Sunday morning, Emma came to find Richard in the kitchen where he was making his now perfected pancakes. She had written something at school, a short essay about family, and she wanted to share it with him. Richard sat down with her at the table, Michael playing with blocks at their feet, and read what his daughter had written. Family, Emma had written in her careful handwriting, is not about being perfect. It's about being there. It's about second chances and learning from mistakes. It's about choosing love even when it's hard. My dad wasn't always there for me, but he is now. And that's what matters. Family is where you can be scared and sad and angry and know that you're still loved. It's where you can make mistakes and know that forgiveness is possible. Family is choosing each other every single day. Richard set down the essay, his vision blurred with tears. He looked at his daughter, this brave, resilient, extraordinary little girl who had survived so much and still had the capacity to forgive, and felt the weight of his failures and his determination to do better merge into a single truth. He would spend the rest of his life being worthy of her forgiveness, of the second chance she had given him. They rebuilt their family slowly, day by day. Emma's nightmares became less frequent. Michael grew into a happy, rambunctious toddler who had no memory of Victoria's cruelty. The staff, freed from fear, brought warmth back to the household. Father Murphy became a regular presence at Sunday dinners. Rebecca Foster, the attorney who had helped bring Victoria to justice, became a friend and advocate for causes supporting abused children. Richard established a foundation in Elizabeth's name, dedicated to supporting children in abusive situations and training mandated reporters to recognize signs of domestic abuse. Emma, when she was older, would become involved in the Foundation's youth programs, using her experience to help other children find their voices and their strength. But that was in the future. For now, they were just a family, learning to heal, learning to trust, learning to love without fear. The Richardson mansion in Greenwich was no longer a place of silence and suffering, but a home filled with laughter, arguments, reconciliation, and the everyday chaos of life. Richard kept his promise. He never abandoned his children again.